Are you a budding designer wondering if you need to know how to sew to be successful? Is learning how to sew really that important? Let's say you have so many amazing ideas. Ideas are great, but design is not about ideas and the sketching of these ideas alone. It is about the execution of your ideas. When you think about it, your ideas are only the beginning, the very first step in the design process. Consumers don't want to buy ideas though, do they? They buy garments. And for your ideas to be transformed into a garment, yes, you do need to know some pattern making and garment construction techniques. You don't need to be an expert at it, but learning the basics will definitely help you find and refine your creative voice. Let's quickly take a look at our lesson objectives. First, we are going to look at how to construct the pleats we have created the patterns for in the last lesson. Then we are going to look at closures, what they are, the different types of closures, and how to choose the right closure for your design. At the end of the lesson, we are going to look at how to sew the different basic closures. Does that sound like a good lesson to you? Let's get going! Designers, welcome to Lesson 8, the last lesson of Module 2, titled Behind the Seams. In the previous lesson, we looked at how to draft different pleats on a pattern. Now, we need to learn how to fold and sew them. As we already know, adding pleats to a garment or design can really transform it into something interesting. Today, we are going to learn how to sew the following pleats: knife pleats, pin tucks, box pleats, and inverted pleats. You will need the following to be able to sew the pleats: your pleat patterns, some fabric, fabric scissors, pins, an iron to press the pleats, a tape measure or a ruler, some thread, the same color as your material, and last but definitely not least, a sewing machine. Your first step will be to cut out the pattern for the pleats. You only need to cut each pleat pattern once out of fabric, as we are only going to make one sample. For best results, please use pre-shrunk fabric that can hold the fold. This you do by washing the fabric before using it. When you place your pattern, please make sure it is on the straight grain, so parallel to the selvage of the fabric. Also remember to cut small nips where the notches are. These nips should be really tiny and not the whole seam allowance to avoid the unraveling of the fabric. You can also mark the nips with a fabric pen if you have one. Next step is to thread your machine and get ready to sew your pleats. I will talk you through these pleats now. First, let's look at the knife pleat. As you can see, I have my pleat pattern already cut out and I've made my little nips. To create the knife pleat, you need to fold over the fabric. So place one nip on top of the other nip. I usually pin it before I sew it just to keep everything in place. You can either sew it into a waistband. For example, let's pretend my pin is the sewing line or the stitching line instead. And there we have a little loose pleat. If you want to sew it like that, you need to sew it into something or horizontally. But you can also sew a constructed or sewn knife pleat and then you sew vertically, like I am going to do now. So you sew on the line that you have created. Usually you will have a drill hole to show you up to where you need to sew. Oh, the video is a little bit wobbly, but you can kind of see what I'm doing. At the end, please remember to backstitch to reinforce the stitch line. Always clean up your work, take away all the unnecessary threads, and there you have it, a sewn in knife pleat. As you can see, it is more structured than the loose pleat. Which one do you like more? Next, we are going to look at pin tucks. Again, I am looking for all of my little notches I've made, and I have quite a few more because we are doing more than one pin tuck. First, I am going to draw in my lines with a marker. This will help me sew in a straight line. Because I want my pleats to fold outwards, I need to mark it on the right side or the face of the fabric. I don't know if you can see my line that well, but it is there. So I will sew on that line. That will become my stitching line. There, you can see it. You can definitely iron in this pleat before you sew. It will make it a little bit easier. So like I've done. Again, I am going to just put a pin where I want my stitch line to end. This you can indicate with a drill hole on your pattern, like we did in the previous lesson. Again, remember to backstitch. After each pleat, I ironed in the next one, and then I sewed them. With these pin tucks, it is important to really be accurate and sew a straight line, as you will be able to see any imperfections. But it is worth it. As you can see, I've ironed them now, all in one direction, and I think they look quite cute. It is an easy way to create an interesting effect. If you want, you can top stitch the pleats down to give an even more structured effect. Now that you have the knife pleat and pin tucks down, let's take a look at how to fold and sew the box pleat. So again, I have my fabric and I'm going to look for the notches. This will help me fold and sew my pleat. So I am going to place one notch on top of another. Then I am going to pin it so the fold is towards the back. And I am going to do the same on the other side, but in the opposite direction. So these little folds will meet in the middle at the back. Without ironing or sewing, I've already created a box pleat. And then at the back, an inverted pleat. So you can either sew it into a waistband, like I'm going to do now, or you can again construct it more like a structured pleat and then follow the steps as we did in the knife pleat example. Again, remember to backstitch the beginning and the end of your sewing line, like I'm doing right now. And there you have it. We've sewn a box pleat. You often see this at the back of tailored shirts and also on skirts. It is a nice way to create volume, and it is an interesting detail. Last but not least is the inverted pleat. Again, I have my piece of fabric and I am looking for the notches. Just like the box pleat, I'm going to match these up, but instead of folding it backward, I'm going to fold it forward so that we create an inverted pleat instead of a box pleat. Again, I always like pinning my pleats just to keep them in place. These folds will also meet in the middle. Don't you just love how the pattern matches up? I didn't plan that, but I love it. Perfect. So now you can again sew it. And there you have it. Once ironed, it looks even better. Your little inverted pleat. It's almost like a little secret, some hidden volume. And then at the back, your box pleat. And that is all the pleating for today. Now that you know how to draft these pleats on a pattern and how to construct them, I hope to see lots of interesting designs featuring these pleats soon. Please pop a message in the Morpheus chat box and tell me whether you are a fan of these pleats or not. Do you think you will be able to add more pleats to your designs now that you know how to draft and construct them? From one detail to another. Next, we are going to focus on one of the most important parts of a garment, and that is the closure. Can you think of a few different closures you can find on a garment? I bet you can look at what you are wearing right now and at least find one. Please tell me what kind of closure you can see on your clothing. What are closures? So, first things first, so that we are all on the same page, closures are sometimes referred to as fasteners, but they mean the same thing. These are functional items that facilitate dressing and undressing, essential to the garment's performance. Did you know the failure of a closure contributes more to customer dissatisfaction and probably the discarding of the garment more than any other failure of other components on the garment? This just shows you the important role closures play in the overall appeal and quality of the garment. This is why this lesson is also such an important one. These closures, as you might have noticed, can be used as a single fastener, like a zip, or in multiples, like a row of buttons on a shirt, or in conjunction with one or more types of closures. A good example of this is a pair of pants. Pants or jeans usually have a zip closure and a button. Closures can be hidden or can be used as a form of decoration, not only used for functional purposes. Sometimes closures are even placed on garments without serving a function, purely for decorative purposes. Let's look at some examples. The first image is an example of a functional closure. This is also an example of multiple closures because we have more than one button working together to hold the two pieces of fabric together. The next image is an example of decorative closures. Instead of it just having a functional purpose, the designer chose to use the buttons as a focal point. This is actually a good example of functional closures that are also decorative and non-functional. The buttons at the top of the jacket are purely there for decorative reasons. And lastly is an example of non-functional closures. Just like the second image, the zip at the center front of the top is purely decorative. There is no need for a closure to get in or out of that garment. The contrasting color choice of the closure also creates a focal point in design. What does that mean? Do you remember from your design principles lesson? Emphasis is created by the use of contrasting colors. Let's take a quick look at some examples of closures. The family of closures is diverse, ranging from buttons, Velcro, press studs, buckles, zips, ties, and hook and eye fastenings, to name a few. Round 2 of Find the Fastener. Which of the following images do you think is an example of a lapped zip? Is it image 1, image 2, or image 3? It is image 1. There is a piece of fabric hiding the zip, and that is why we call it the lapped zip. Image 2 is a center zip, and image 3 is an example of an invisible zip. Usually, invisible zips are added when the designer does not want the zip to be seen, so instead of it looking like a zip, it just looks like a seam in the garment. As if you don't already have a lot of things to consider when you are designing, here is another. Along with the design elements, the principles, the trends, and the fabric properties, you also have to consider how to facilitate the dressing and undressing of your garment. This you need to indicate on your sketches before the pattern making phase. The choice of your closure will dramatically influence the style and the quality of your garments, so you really have to take this into consideration when designing. When selecting a closure, you have to consider the design and the design's purpose. If you are, let's say, designing a wedding dress, the bride will probably want to have nice covered buttons and loops instead of an exposed plastic zip, right? The placement of the closure is also important, and this has more to do with the design than the purpose. If you have a close-fitting dress and need a zip, but you don't want any seams in the back of the dress, you need to indicate on your pattern that you want the zip to be placed on the side seam. The size of the closure has to do with both purpose of the design and the function of the closure, and whether or not you want to use the closures as part of decoration, like the gold buttons we saw earlier. The security and the stress of the fastener refers to the size, type, and quality. If it is a fastener that is going to be used often, it has to be of better quality, right? That makes sense. You also have to keep in mind the fabric properties when deciding on the type of closure. If you have a design constructed out of a lightweight fabric, you can't have a heavy metal zip as it will distort and pull the fabric. Same with heavier fabrics. You can't have a teeny tiny button holding together heavy pieces of fabric. Due to the lack of security because of the amount of stress, the closure won't be able to fulfill its purpose. It is also important to consider the cost of your closure. For example, if you are creating a dress out of expensive silk material, you can't put a plastic zip in it. The closure should match the design. The last one is important to consider when designing. When deciding on the type of closure, please choose something that you are familiar with. Like I've mentioned, the quality of construction of these fasteners are one of the most important aspects to the consumer. Rather do something simple really well than a complicated closure badly. I'm not saying learn to do one thing and keep doing it. Obviously, we want our skill level to improve. It is great and important to experiment with different closures as long as your final product is of excellent quality. Before we look at how to sew these closures, let's quickly take a look at our skill progression. You are going to learn so many new skills in Module 3, but before we take a quick look at all the interesting and wonderful things you will learn, let's celebrate all the skills that you have already gained since you have started this course. Because moving from experimentation to mastery, you need to reflect on what you are learning. When you look at the fashion design theory, drawing and illustration, design development, pattern making, and garment construction skills, you have the basics down. Congratulations, guys! Do you know what this means? You can now further develop the skills and master them. It is time to get all of you super excited about what is to come in Module 3. In Module 3, we will investigate other aspects of the fashion design field, including pattern draping, hand sewing, and you will be introduced to computer-aided design. All of this will help you to create a fashion collection. Get ready, guys, because Module 3 is going to be a blast. Stretch fabrics make up a huge majority of our wardrobes because they are comfortable to wear and require minimal care. But is the sewing of stretch fabrics just as easy as it is wearing them? It is no secret that stretchy fabric can be somewhat of a challenge when it comes to the construction of a garment. Knowing how to sew stretch fabric is a key skill that will give you the confidence to push your sewing skills. Trust me, after the next lesson you will realize it really is not as difficult as you might think. Do you want to learn how to add these closures to a garment during the construction phase? Well, you are in luck because that is exactly what we are going to learn next. The construction of closures. Because we only have a short time together, we are only going to look at the most basic closures today, and these are buttons and buttonholes and the basic center zip. Are you ready? Buttons are available in a variety of different materials such as plastic, metal, glass, mother of pearl, or covered in fabric. Before we start sewing, let's look at how to determine the size of your buttonhole and the placement of buttonholes on a pattern. You might be wondering, why is the size of a button so important? Well, the size of the button will determine the buttonhole's length. Bought patterns usually have the size of the buttonhole already determined, but if you want a different size button or if you are drafting your own pattern, this is the way to determine the size of your buttonhole. Measure your button from one side to the other. As a general rule, buttonhole should be 3 millimeters bigger than the button diameter, or an eighth of the button's length. The depth of your button should also be considered. If you have a fat button, you need to add extra length, about an eighth of your button's diameter, to the buttonhole's length. Let's look at an example. Let's say this button on the screen is 4 centimeters. Then we will have to add 3 millimeters to it. This button is not very thick, so I'm not going to add another eighth, which means my button size will then be what? It will be 4.3 centimeters in length. Now that I know the length of the buttonhole, we can determine the placement of it on the button stand. Now this really depends on your design and where and how far apart you want the buttons to be. In this example, I want the buttons to be in the middle of my button stand. Note the red line indicating the middle. Let's start with point A to B. I've measured down 6 centimeters from the top. This will be the top of my buttonhole. From that point, point B, I have marked my buttonhole length, and this will be point B to C. From point C, I have measured down 6 again to point D to keep the space between the buttons and the buttonholes consistent. First, let's look at the basic block I used to create my samples. A to B will be 12 centimeters. A to C, 30 centimeters. B to D will be 2.5 centimeters, and that will be my button stand. D to E will be another 2.5 centimeters, and that will be my button stand facing. E to F will be 1 centimeters, and that will be my seam allowance. Let's quickly look at how to create a machine stitch buttonhole. So as you can see, I am measuring out my buttonholes. In this case, I've used a 2 centimeter length. It is really important to keep it consistent, the distances between the buttonholes. As you can see, I've marked my buttonholes with a little line from the top to the bottom point, and this will help me when I need to sew. It was a bit wobbly over there. As you can see, I have a buttonhole foot. Usually your machine will come with one, or you can buy an extra one. It does cost a little bit of money, but it is worth it. You can create really nice buttonholes. And there you have it. Quick and easy machine stitch buttonhole. But what if you don't have that buttonhole foot? Don't worry, just change your machine to the zigzag stitch and change the width and the length of it. Before you sew your buttonhole, just on a scrap piece of fabric, test whether or not your stitch length and width is correct. Like that. So for this, I've drawn a little block that I'm going to follow. I have to do a little bit of extra work because I don't have my buttonhole foot doing all of that for me. And that is why I drew in the little block. As you can see, I keep lifting my foot just to check that I have sewn up to the point. And I'm doing the same to the other side. Now I'm changing my stitch to a straight stitch, and I'm just connecting the two rows of stitching, if you can call it that. As you can see, I am reinforcing my stitch quite a lot, and I'm doing the same to the bottom of the buttonhole. And there you have it. Now, to open this, you need to use your unpicker. I've seen many people ruin their garment by just pushing. So instead of just pushing, make sure that you bring your tip to the front again and take or open or cut the buttonhole in sections. Please be careful. Don't hurt yourself. Take your time. And after you have done that, you can see that there are quite a few little loose threads. Now is the time to neaten your buttonhole. Take away all of the unnecessary threads, and then you will have a neat buttonhole ready for its button. And there you have it, a machine stitch buttonhole. So to sew on your buttons, just like the buttonholes, you need to measure your button stand and draw in your button placement. Again, make sure that the spacing between the buttons are even. For this, you need a hand sewing needle and a thread, and make a little knot at the end of your thread. So first we are going to sew a sew through button with 2 holes. To start at the back, pull your thread through, and I always like to make like a little reinforcing stitch. Then you can take your button, place your button. You can decide whether you want the holes to be vertical or horizontal. And then you start sewing your button. It is quite simple. You just sew through the button and the fabric. And that's all you do. Fun fact, when I was interning a few years ago, I had to sew buttons every day for about 4 months. Before you finish your button, go through one hole, but don't put the needle through the fabric, and wrap the thread around the button. This will create some space between the button and the fabric, and that will be for the buttonhole, the extra fabric for the buttonhole. as you can see. Now is the time to neaten the back. Like I've said, the back of your garment or the inside of your garment should be just as neat as the outside. To do that, just create a little worm by going underneath the thread with your needle a few times. Also create a little knot at the end, which is what I'm doing now. And never cut your thread. Try and push the needle in between the two layers of fabric. As you can see, it's not on the outside. Push it through to either the edge of the button stand or the seam and then cut it. And there you have it, a nice little 2-hole button. Now we have a sew-through button with 4 holes. Again, I create my little reinforcing stitch. And with this button, you can decide whether you want to have it like a little square or a crisscross effect. I always like the crisscross with 4-hole buttons. And you really just follow the same steps as before. You create your stitches. You will create your little bed by wrapping the thread around it. And you will neaten the back or inside of your garment. As you can see here, I'm wrapping. So for this button, I would probably add some extra length to the buttonhole because as you can see, it is quite a thick one. Our last example is a shank button, so it's not a sew through, but you kind of follow the same steps. I'm going to push it through like that. And then just stitch it a few times. I like to play with this button to feel if it's strong enough, if I need more stitches. So you can see like I've just done. With this one, because it's a shank button, you don't need to create a bed because it already has one technically. So there you have it, our 3 different buttons. Which one do you like the most? And now we are going to take a look at sewing a basic center zip. The tape is the cloth part of the zip. You can see in the image that it has a top extension and bottom extension, and that is the extra tape at the top and the bottom of the zip. The teeth interlock, making it possible for the zip to close. When we measure the zip, it is from the top to the bottom of the teeth without the tape extensions. The slider is the part used to open and close the teeth, and the pull is the part used as a handle to move the slider up and down. Then you also get the top and the bottom stop. This is the part of the zip that stops the slider from moving. Let's look at the different types of zips. You get a metal zip, those have metal teeth, and zips with plastic teeth. Metal zips can endure more wear and tear than plastic, so when working with plastic zips, remember, don't iron it, the teeth will melt. Open-ended zips are often found in jackets, and it is different from other zips because it doesn't have a bottom stop. The zip can open all the way. The last zip for today is the invisible zip. Notice that the teeth are hidden. So how do you construct a zip? let's first look at the pattern I used to create my sample. So A to B is 12 centimeters, B to C is 30 centimeters, and B to D is 1.5 centimeter zip seam allowance. When you are adding a zip to your pattern, always make sure that you have a wider seam allowance, so 1.5 and not just 1 centimeters. So let's look at the center zip demo. I have my 2 pattern pieces cut out and I've overlocked the edges. If you can, that would be a good idea. Now I'm going to sew my 1.5 centimeter seam allowance or zip allowance in. I'm going to measure my zip, so from the top to the bottom, 2, and it's 15 centimeters. I'm going to indicate that on my pattern. The top 1 centimeter I measured is my seam allowance at the top. So from the 1 centimeter down, it will be 15 centimeters. Now that I'm going to sew with a tacking stitch. So as you can see on my machine, the stitch length is quite a bit longer than my normal stitch. I do this so that I can unpick that later. As you can see, I've reinforced my stitch when I changed it to a normal stitch length. Okay, now I'm going to place my zip and I'm going to place it facing down because we want the pull to be towards the outside of the garment, right? Don't worry too much about the extra length on the top extension of the tape. You want to measure from the stopper your seam allowance up because you want the top stop to be at the seam line. So I like to open my zip when I'm placing it. I'm folding away the other fabric. I'm just working with my seam allowance. So with the teeth facing towards the seam, I'm now going to pin my zip. Again, just through the seam allowance layer. And then I'm going to sew that line with a zip foot. As you can see, there's gaps in the foot, which makes it possible to go or sew closer to the teeth. I know it looks horrible, the white thread on the purple zip, but obviously you should choose the right color that will match your zip, and your zip should match your fabric. I'm only using a purple one with white thread to make it more visible for you guys. Always remember to backstitch. Now I am going to do the same on the other side. You can also, if you want, do this first step with a tucking stitch and unpick it at a later stage if you want to. It will definitely give it a neater look at the end. Now, as you can see, I need to unpick my tacking. If you want to keep it in until the last step, you are more than welcome to do so too. I think sewing, like everything else, you kind of feel what is most natural to you or what kind of process you like the most. Again, be careful when you are unpicking and take away all those unnecessary threads. So as you can see, we have a zip and we are almost done. We just need to tack this part. We left that because the pull and the slider was in the way. So now we need to quickly go back and sew that line. After you've sewn that, you can sew around or top stitch your zip to keep it in place. I use quite a lot of pins because I want it to be neat and tidy. Mark your zip stop. You don't want to sew over that because your sewing machine needle will probably break. And I have a surprise for you. Mine did. So be extra sure when you mark it. So as you can see, I've now changed my needle position and I'm sewing on the center line with my guide, taking the pins out as I sew. Perfect. So as you can see, I turned before my white pin, that was the mark for my stopper, and then I broke my needle. I kept this in so that you guys can see that these things do happen, and you just continue and you make a plan. So back to work we go. When we sew up to our mark, and then we move across. The stopper and the pull and the slider will be in the way again, so you just sew up to a point where you can't anymore. Reinforce your stitch, and then you can come back to that afterwards. And there you have it. A neatly sewn center zip, and this is really the most common zip. You can do everything with this zip. Obviously it will look better if it was a white zip. Here is a little tip for you. Now that you have already created some construction samples, create a reference folder with all of your samples in it. Keeping your samples in a folder with plastic sleeves pinned to a piece of paper. You can also add notes and the construction steps to it. The benefit of having this reference folder is that you can always refer to it. Don't remember how to sew a pleat? Just check your sample file. Can't remember the zip construction steps? No worries, refer to your file. This file does not have to be super neat, but should be a library of your experiments that will help you in the future. Like I mentioned in the introduction, you don't have to be an expert at pattern making and sewing, but it is important to learn a little bit about these phases in the production cycle. Remember, experience is the best teacher. Take a piece of fabric and run it through the machine. Change the stitch length and width and see what it does. Play around and experiment a little. Make mistakes. make a lot of mistakes, and learn from it. You will learn best through the experience of trying. Remember, it is your job to turn your ideas into physical clothes. Your ideas mean nothing if you can't bring them to life. Sketching is important, and yes, I know I love sketching too. It is an essential part of design, but it is important to remember that sketching is two-dimensional and fashion is very much three-dimensional. Fashion design is all about taking your inspiration and turning it into something physical for people to admire. This being said, there are pattern makers and seamstresses out there who can turn your design into a physical garment. But remember, and I'm going to end the lesson with this, for every skill that you don't learn, you limit yourself to what kind of designer you can be. So the next time you are faced with new information or a new skill, instead of turning away because you don't want to learn something new or you think it's too difficult, ask yourself, will this new thing, whatever it may be, help me to become the designer I want to be? For today's lesson, I want you to create your very own sample file, and in it should be your seams, your pleats, and your closures. I suggest you create this file for yourself to keep your samples in, and it is really nice to refer to and investigate the samples if or when you have forgotten how to construct a certain detail. I've been sewing for over 10 years and I still refer to my sample file. Please remember to share this on your favorite social media channel and use the hashtag #SureFashionConstruction. Designers, remember the summary notes and webinar slides are available in your toolkit, and this is super handy to refer to throughout and after this course. Please remember to do your lesson assignment after the lesson. This is to test your knowledge so that when you get to the final assignment, you know the content so well that you will ace it. Once you have completed all of your lesson assignments, you will unlock your final module assignment. This you will need to complete and pass if you want to receive your professional diploma in fashion design from Shaw Academy. Good luck, guys. I hope you all do really well. And just like that, you have completed half of the fashion design course. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I have really loved creating these lessons for you and seeing all of your amazing work. I really hope you have enjoyed this course so far. I am super excited to have you all back in my virtual classroom for the next half of this course. Until then, as always, stay fashionable.